There we go. Hello to everyone who is watching today. This is Anox Talk. Anox Talk. I'm Lavon. This is my sister Tracy. How are you today, Tracy?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm getting ready for a long week trip out of town, and I got everything ready for that. So now I just wanted to concentrate on some really interesting stuff I've been studying. I'm working on seminary courses, but through the Methodist Theological Seminary of Ohio, and I've taken a really interesting class this semester called Social Justice and Sacred Texts. And that's what we'll be talking about today. And you've agreed to allow me to use this in my actual final presentation for this course. So thank you so much.
No problem. I hope it helped.
Yeah. I'm really interested to see what you'll think. I know we've talked about some of the things that I've been reading and watching for this particular course. And I guess the first thing that they did in this course, which I thought was really cool, was they did a post assessment, and they asked you to write like a couple pages on what you thought social justice was and also what you thought sacred text was. So I have that in my post or my pre-assessment, and I thought I would ask you just to kind of see where you land on things, and then like after we discuss some of the stuff that I brought, and I did I'm doing a little PowerPoint for you. Maybe it'll be the same or different. So I guess starting with like social justice, do you have some concept that you would, basically an elevator talk about what you would say if someone said, what's your idea of social justice?
Sure. My condensed version of social justice means leveling the playing field. Just that simple. We can break social justice concepts down into three specific areas. Four.
Or four. 3 or 4.
One is human rights, of course. 2 is participation. In regard to vocalizing the issues, participation and being allowed to communicate about it.
Part of that conversation.
Right.
Equity,
of course. And I don't know how to count. So anyway, I found an awesome article. It is from a website called Human Rights Careers. And they maintain that there are 3 key facts in regard to social justice. 1 is important, encouraging, interest in social justice has been increasing. And number 2, corporations use the language of social justice to attract customers. So it can be a marketing technique. And then still not able to count. No, number 3, in our society today, we see that the term social justice, especially social justice warriors, is often used as an insult.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
By people that don't understand or don't agree with the concepts of social justice.
Would you say it's kind of like the word woke?
Exactly. Yeah. And so 3 major examples in our world today of social justice issues are, number 1, income equality. And I'd like to kind of come back to that one because I found another awesome, and that goes right into the gender pay gap.
Right.
But from an eco-theological point of view.
Okay, stop there and explain about what it is to be an eco-theologist. My sister is an eco-theologist, and she has a great brain about how to explain this. So I love to hear this. So what would you say about that?
To make it overly simple, I would say that eco-theology is the philosophy of ecology. The philosophy as it relates to our environment. beyond the science, beyond the politics, beyond perceptions, just simply the philosophies, and of course, the opposing philosophies. So that can encompass eco-theology as meaning a broad-based term, not just a theory on, for instance, remedies for human-induced global climate change. Some can take the exact opposite views.
Right. And I think like one of the other things that you said that I think could use a little bit of descriptors is the word equity. It's very different than equality.
Equity, in my mind, again, goes back to leveling the playing field so that disadvantaged people can have access to prosperity in a civilization, in a society.
Yeah, that's well said.
And equity in a social justice context is the justice of fairness, and equity as fairness.
Right. I saw this really great image one time about the difference, and finally, for me, I'm such an image person, you know, and it had these people, and it said, "Here's an example of equality," and it had these people that were trying to look over a fence. Well, they were all different heights, and so equality was they all were given the exact same height barrel to stand on, but the people who were really short still couldn't see over. And then equity was they were all given barrels that were high enough that each of them could see over the fence.
Exactly. That's a wonderful way to illustrate it.
Yeah. So social justice in the context of sacred texts has been really interesting from the perspective of the main, I would call them probably the main most well-known religious orders, such as Christian and Buddhist and such like that. And my presentation, which I'll give here shortly, just discusses those in terms of what sacred texts they use. And I'm wondering, for eco-theology and for your perspective on sacred texts, what would you use or call your sacred texts? Or would you call other people's maybe? It doesn't have to be like a personal sacred text if you have none. What would you describe as a sacred text?
Well, this is really interesting because first thought is books. The Bible, the Quran, the Book of Mormon. Books, tangible pages where things are written and recorded. But religious texts do not have to be written. They can be oral. As a matter of fact, that's what probably most sacred texts are derived from oral traditions, which I found really, really interesting. And here's a cool thing from a sort of an esoteric point of view. So some sacred texts have no meaning unless they are spoken. The intonation, the tone, the human voice, the frequency that emanates from a human's voice box is what gives the text power.
Wow. I love that. This has been a really challenging class for me because I had to examine, like, what are my sacred texts personally? And I am a Unitarian Universalist, as you know, and I sort of have that affectation that many of us have that doesn't want there to be the authority that comes with sacred texts in my personal experience. I don't want the word sacred to be used in a way that represents oh gosh, what is the best word? Authority. It's just as simple as that. I don't want anything else to have authority over me. So I really struggle with this.
That's
one of
a
the things that
very
we did.
valid point, because we know that the sacred texts have been politically edited, personally, they have all been changed from what the original oral
Right.
text
And
was.
taken out of context and used for wars and such. And social justice is very interesting in that context because, well, we were raised Catholic. I still consider myself Catholic. I think you do, which is a very personal decision. There is things that we love about Catholicism. I know we've talked about it. I really love the ritual. I don't like anything, because I'm just such a Gen Xer, I guess, that is presumptive of authority within that context. I also am really trying hard not to um, take my personal religious or sacredness, if I can call it that. I am also agnostic. So that lends itself to a lack of the word sacred being applicable to my experience. But then I'm also like, oh yeah, let's have, winter solstice and go be little pagans. And like, I do have ancestor worship, in my ritual. Um, I suppose we fall into the pantheist framework where if there is a God or if there is something divine, it's found in everything, including ourselves. And then also, of course, the pagan, sort of, in my experience, is more like uh, a worship of and a gratefulness for the experiences of those who came before me and gave me the opportunity to live at a time where I have a choice. I mean, the privilege that I have to sit here and say all of what I just said is really phenomenal. Just really takes me into a situation of gratefulness. And I guess that's why, once again, when I'm applying the sacred text, to our experience, I'm like, oh, the Beatitudes, those are definitely my sacred texts. If I had to say sacred, if that word is used within my context. Do you feel like you have any sacred texts?
Yes, I love the parables of Jesus. Those beautiful little stories that children can understand, and we're taught these beautiful little lessons as children. We're supposed to keep that in our brains, in our actions, in our lives for the rest of our life. But in our own church, that gets subverted as
Right.
we get older. And
Right.
then it becomes a very adulterated interpretation of,
Yeah.
because of the dogma that's applied. I
Right.
personally reject the dogma of the Catholic Church. I adore Pope Francis, and I have so much respect for him as a scholar and a philosopher and a wise, wonderful person, a gift to people in our time. My Catholicism is my ethnic and cultural heritage.
Right.
It's
I
not my
agree with that.
religion.
Yep.
It used to be.
Yeah. Well, and you had the experience of also going to Catholic school, and I did not. I was too little. So I always find it really interesting to talk with you about this because I know that you, as my older sibling, the oldest in our family, and me as the baby, our experiences were very different. And yet we come to I just really enjoy our conversations because even if like I've sat here and said, well, I'm agnostic, I didn't feel you go, ugh, where other people in our family would, and yet that is an honoring of, other people's system and a belief and journey. And one of the things that was really fascinating about this class is we started out reading a book. I have it here, and it is called Freedom, Equality, and Justice in Islam. It was my first exposure to Islamic or Muslim justice. I was kind of shocked. And I did want to talk about that, but I wanted to make sure you were finished with your point because excited about this topic. So I tend to go, blah, blah, blah. Do you want to mention anything else about sacred text before I go into the presentation portion?
Well, there was so much wonderful information in a article that I read that's attributed to Karen Armstrong, who was a formal nun, or
Oh, yes.
a formal nun. She was very formal in her nunnery, but
She wore formal dresses.
she said that she is the one that brought to my attention the existence of the fact that scripture is usually sung, chanted, or declaimed in a way that separated it from mundane speech. Wow. It was all elevated speech, so that the words, and here's the cool scientific part of it, the words are product of the brain's left hemisphere.
Oh, wow.
Fused with the more indefinable emotions of the right.
Right. I love that.
So it's like when you speak the sacred texts, you're using both parts of your brain, the analytic and the artistic, if we can simplify it that much.
That's right. Yep.
The power of the artistic.
And we talk a lot about science in our podcast. We talk a lot about, how to blend because we're very scientific, and we were raised like that. And at the same time, if I could say this, the sacredness certainly comes through science for me. So I'm so glad you said that, like that left brain, right brain. I'm fascinated by brain integration and all of the things that happen when the brain is actually allowed to listen to frequencies. Right. You've brought to our conversations a lot about frequencies and the things that heal our bodies, and the science is there now showing that that's true. And so it's interesting to think about something being sacred just for the inflection, and just for that, exactly. And how it actually, involves science. Yeah. So I hadn't heard that. So I love that.
Think about the Eucharist, the ritual of the Eucharist. Without the prescribed word that the priest speaks during the Eucharist that's accepted by the Catholic Church, the ritual doesn't hold as much power.
Right.
It needs those words, the intonations, the chanting. So many people that I know that are not familiar with the Catholic Church are like, the chanting freaks me out. It's like Satanism.
Right. Well, and even the ritual of standing and kneeling, like, I remember people making fun of me for being Catholic and being like, oh, you're going to stand or kneel or blah, 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 and all that. And I found that later on. Of course, I've been through every thought about my Catholic experience. I've gone from ultimately, a very immature sort of holding of arms to an embracing of what I can sustain, which is part of me. And once again, part of our ancestry that I just really love, and that makes for me every day better. So I want to maintain whatever I believe is life affirming from my ritual, from my quote unquote religion. I found that to be really relevant as a Unitarian Universalist in most of my experiences, like outside of religion, have had that affect. So it's really interesting to hear you say similarly,
By the way,
go ahead.
Healing, can I tell you a quick little thing about healing? Going to parochial school meant mass every morning before school when we first started out, and then towards in the middle of the 70s, it was only mass on Fridays. Of course, we were expected to go to mass on the weekend, but we spent a lot of time in mass, and we spent a lot of time on those kneelers. And we had a wonderful semi-ancient nun in our parish. She was formidable, but she was smart. And she's called our attention to kneeling where we slouch while we're kneeling. She said, no, that's not okay. When you kneel, you kneel. You're showing subservience to the Lord for one thing, but you slouch because you're uncomfortable kneeling straight up and down like this. And so you slouch to be more comfortable. Was Jesus comfortable hanging on the cross?
Right. I remember those conversations, right? Yeah.
And whether that's relevant or not to the bigger issue, I just remember that and know that as Catholics, we're supposed to honor the fact that our Savior died for our sins, if that's how you want to believe,
Right.
by kneeling. And
Right.
it isn't, I don't know what other people think
Believe.
that kneeling is for, but
Right.
it's more than meets the eye.
Sure. Well, yeah, kneeling in prayer, you know. And I mean, look at how, I mean, speaking of kneeling, you know, that I apologize, I don't remember names, but you know, that athlete, that football superstar kneeling. Look at the response that kneeling.
And the hypocrisy. I think he was wonderful.
Oh,
me,
I loved it.
The way that the religious right reacted to that, because basically they view politics as a team sport, but you mix your sports and your religion, and that's a no-no, even though they insist on mixing
message
sports with and religion with government.
Right. Well, and there's a lot of, you know, I mean, there's a lot of praying and things. And
Colin Kaepernick, I think is how.
Yeah. And also, you know, kneeling was during the national anthem. And, you know, it started to make me go, why do we do a national anthem at sports, you know? Yeah. So that's a very interesting, we could talk about an entire, you know.
The same people who will say, don't mix sports and politics and religion are the same ones that are trying to make us a Christian nation.
Right. It's very, very disconcerting to me to think about having that much influence from religion, especially as a non-religious quote-unquote person.
It's the basis of the United States of America, to escape from religion and government, to escape from a feudal system.
Right.
And give everybody supposedly an equity,
right,
playing field, so that a commoner could own land.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, and to not pay taxes to the king. So one of the things I had to do when we took this class, I worked with two gentlemen on a case study. The case study, I think I talked to you about as we were doing it, and we chose to do the case study on unhomed in Ohio, in Athens, Ohio. And we did a lot of abstracts, you know, from a lot of actual other case studies and case reviews. And that was really interesting. But what got really interesting was when we started, one of the gentlemen that was in our group was a minister. He's a Black minister, and it's a Bible-based ministry. They were talking a lot about using the homeless shelters there to shore up what the government, you know, basically intends churches to do as nonprofits. You know, there was some really interesting feedback from him about that, because as a neurodivergent person, I really could relate to the feeling that doing what they were doing, which was basically a soup kitchen, and they were working with other churches that they would schedule out. So they would say, you know, this Methodist church does the soup kitchen on Mondays, this Baptist church does it on Tuesdays, theirs happens to fall on Wednesdays. And so they would see the same people showing up, and they would go over to these other, you know, soup kitchens and sort of, you know, assist if they needed help. And they would see the same people there. And so they were looking at that, and he was like, you know, what's the social justice aspect here? Like, how is this doing anything to assist them? And he really started to talk a lot about the loaves and fishes what did you call it? Parable. And so we started to really talk a lot about that. And then he's like, this is just not the right way. This isn't the way. And so we had all these different aspects or perspectives of that particular parable, which I thought was really interesting. And one of the things that he said was, a lot of people think that Jesus used his magic and he made it so that the loaves and fishes, okay, you had one loaf and you had one fish, and he did magic, and then there was barrels of fishes and barrels of bread. But what he said was that he believed there was actually just a lot of people there, and they all started to put little pieces of fish in one barrel and little pieces of bread in the other barrels, and that managed to feed 10,000. And so we started looking at this case study from that perspective, and we found this. It was a very weird thing, because one of the guys that was in my case study, his brother is a Methodist preacher, and he had written a book about abundiculture. And abundiculture being basically everyone brings their gifts and they share their gifts, and it's enough, and it's always enough. So I mentioned that because it's important in this particular presentation to discuss what we learned during the course. And what we also had to do is look at the different organizations that we were looking at, and look at what sacred texts they brought to define their social justice. Well, we purposefully found it was real easy to look at, the religious or Christian shelters and go, okay, well, here's an example of what they use. What was harder, or more complex at least, was looking at secular organizations and what they used as sacred texts. And that's when I was like, oh, sacred texts are not necessarily what I was thinking. Like, they're not all
fascinating.
Isn't that like, yeah. They're not like this, the sea scrolls. What were we talking about? Not Red Sea, but the scrolls that we were talking about the other day, Dead Sea scrolls. Yeah. Like, I'm thinking, like, in my pre-assessment, like, I literally wrote that. I was like, oh, I think of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think of historical. I think of languages that aren't necessarily what I speak now, in all of, like, Greek, Hebrew, and all of those, lending their authority, essentially. Oh. So what we had found was a book, basically, that had been written about abundiculture, which was from a secular perspective. It was listening to talent, listening to the talent and recognizing the talent. So one of the things that they did in this particular abundiculture was, instead of a person coming to a shelter and saying, let me fill out the paperwork, it's 10 pages of, where am I at? Where am I living? What do I make? What's my income? How many people do I have to feed? That sort of thing. It was like a 10-page resume. It was like a CV. Like, what are your talents? What are your skills? What are the things that you could bring to the table in the event that you were called upon? And it changed the entire dynamic. So one of the things they talked about in the book was this lady who happened to be a Latina, and she had written, well, I really love to cook, and I like to cook for groups. I can cook for groups over 10. And they were like, well, we have this space that we rent out for money that we make or whatever for this ministry. And people are always asking who we should use for a caterer. Would you cater? There's a kitchen you can use right there. And she said, sure. It turned out she made this incredible feast, and she knew how to do it very cheaply because she was poor, And so she did that. And then they were like, well, do you have business cards? And so it just grew and grew and grew. And the people that would come, and they would be like filling out this paperwork and say, yeah, I love to cook, or I'm really good at prepping in a kitchen, or I'm really helpful in serving and that sort of stuff. They would all find her and be like, how can I help you? And so it was assistive, but it was also like this self promoting and the ability to help, and at the same time get the assistance that you might need. And her situation was, she did work, She could only find part-time work because she was caring for a certain amount of people. I don't know her family situation or whatever, like many of us who can't work a full-time job because they might be taking care of an elderly person or a disabled person or that sort of thing. So it was really neat to come through that case study and not go, well, it's not really working. It's actually really, really hard on the churches and communities that are offering these services, because they're looking at it like, this will never change. We will die, and there will still be poor people who need to come here for soup on Wednesday. And it empowered this gentleman, this preacher, in our group, so much so that he's presenting this in workshops now. And I mean, just giving hope to the people who are trying to help.
Fantastic. We
Cool.
sometimes forget about the people that are trying to help when all
Yep.
our focus goes on the people that are being helped.
Exactly. And the other things, and I know I'm going to go into my presentation mode here, but the other things that we had to talk and think about, which was really interesting for me, coming from a Catholic / Christian, foundation, I had not looked into, Judeo-Christian, yes. Okay. So that's kind of in my wheelhouse. But then we started looking at, like I said, this book, and this gentleman is talking about the justice in Islam. And this is a book by Mohammed Hashim Kamali. And just like on the back, for example, he does 3 concepts of freedom, equality, and justice from an Islamic point of view, and their manifestations in the religious, social, legal, and political fields. So he goes into the Quran and the Sunnah and pulls out, text. So it's proof text that, this is part of their system of justice. This is part of their tradition. So that was really, really helpful and enlightening. And I really liked that aspect. We also read a book by a rabbi, and he writes about, which I had no idea, their political or geographical even systems are social justice narratives. And it's fascinating to know what they believe and what they practice through their customs. And
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
Regarding do you think that the sacred texts of the secular community would be for instance, the Constitution and its predecessor, the Magna Carta?
For some people's sacred texts that I learned in this class are poems. They're books, they're songs. They are inspiring speeches. They are inspiring ministry.
Fabulous.
They could find, the basis for their social justice just about anywhere. And
the book by Khalil Gibran, I can never say it. What's the title of that fabulous? That could be a sacred text, even though it isn't related to any specific religion, as well as, I don't know if you remember this, but it's just begging my brain to say this.
Yeah.
In the 70s, there is a little book that was published called Jonathan Livingston Seagull.
Right.
Do you remember that?
I do remember that. Yes. I'm looking for a book I wanted to bring.
It was very simple and beautiful, and it appealed to just about everybody. It really resonated in the 70s.
I remember it being at the house.
People both found it to be quite enlightening and a simple guide.
Right. Yeah. And then that, brings you to outside of our experience, like Buddhism and Hindu, texts. Those are, and this is what I've always known, and yet to relearn it in this lens was so different, because we've talked about this before. Both you and I have been in grad school for Native American studies. And one of the things I think that really appealed to us was the idea that things that we bring into the daily ritual or into our experience. How am I saying this correctly? I don't know. But Native Americans, they really have an ability, even with no written sacred texts, to embrace the sacred through the daily experience. And I loved that. I was really enchanted by that, and like by their literature and by their music. And I think about what you were talking about as far as like their singing. Like I remember when I was working with the gentleman in Lewistown in adult education, and how we were like, oh well, we should do some meditation with them for and they were like, wait a second, let us show you what we do. And you get in a drum circle, and pretty soon you're just whoa. And that reminded me a lot about the fact that Native Americans social justice is a lot about safety, and it's narrated in an oral tradition from birth, because they were nomadic in a lot of nations and tribal nations, and they didn't want their babies roaming off and getting eaten by a bear, or that sort of thing. And so a lot of, I'm going to call it mythology, but not in a way that I mean to be rude or disrespectful. And so I started reading more and more about well, especially Judaism in this class, and Islam. Those are legalese. I mean, legalese. I mean, it is so,
The law.
4,000 years, 4,000 years of scholarly thought on how to be a citizen in a social justice context. And what fascinates me is when I look at what's happening, and I don't want to get into this really heavily in this particular conversation, but what's happening with Israel right now, if they looked at their own sacred texts, and that's what I guess is partially my frustration with sacred texts that is important to this conversation. They can be there. Those sacred texts can be available. And I can go out and I can say, my sacred text is the Bible. But the minute I start to do what I feel as let's say, a Christian nationalist, I have literally not learned anything from Christ.
Christian nationalism to opposing forces, to absolutely opposing forces, and to join them together is what has destroyed democracies as long as human beings have been civilized in societies.
Because the nation becomes the golden calf.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it also ignores all of the ideals of equity.
Right.
And it promotes a system of being born wealthy, being a superior being to someone who struggles against cumulative disadvantage.
Right. Well, and let's just, we've got about 10 minutes left here, and let's just talk about this. My struggle, which I think is important to this conversation, and I know you and I have talked about this before, with taking sacred texts that were written by men for men that leave out women, leave out brown people, leave out LGBT plus, LBGTQ plus. Sorry, guys. It to me isn't rational. It doesn't make sense to me to promote. I don't feel part of that. Yeah. And so that's why, we had an aunt, and she was a nun, and she was a nun for over 60 years, and she just passed away, Sister Claude Ellen Pentecost. We loved and adored her. We watched her live her life as a sister of the Humility of Mary. And what I found really fascinating about that was she felt that way too. She could be a nun, but she couldn't be a priest. So her sacred texts that she believed in were heavily influenced by, thank God, I'm so glad she had this avenue, Mary, Madonna, the mother of Christ, the mother of God in her context. Her sacred text, very much influenced by Mary, which gave her an outlet, which, in terms of, I've had this conversation with her many times where, she was how old was she when she died? 92 last spring. The youngest nun in her nunnery, I don't know the word, convent, was in their 70s. So what does that tell you? How women have looked at being nuns and sisters has changed dramatically in our lifetime.
Yes, this directly relates to the principle of social justice that is known as participation. Let me read you something really quick.
Yes, please.
Participation is all about making space for and empowering those who have been silenced.
Right.
So right there, the women are not empowered. They are silenced because they're relegated to only being nuns and not allowed to be priests.
Right.
So that she saw.
Yep.
She saw. She couldn't do anything about it. Participation is a principle of democracy as well. Yeah. It's essential to achieve equality, freedom, and accountability.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know if she was happy. She knew that she was glad she didn't, get married. She knew that she had a calling. We talked about her calling a lot. We talked about the fact that she was very young the first time she received a calling, and she ignored it. And then we talked about, what it was like for her to basically tell her parents, who were very Catholic, they were not pleased, especially her dad. And it took her a while to realize it was because he didn't like how women were second-class citizens.
Wow.
Yeah, grandpa. And she didn't understand that he felt that way until she was actively being, she was highly regarded as an educator, and she was an administrator in parochial schools for the first part of her life and career. She had many careers, as we all typically do and stuff, but that was her, choice, because at that time, here's a great example. The nuns could only choose to either be an educator or a nurse. Now they can choose to be lawyers. There are doctors who are nuns. There are anything you can think of, but their ministry, has to still come first. And that's fine. That's the choice they made. So, I know that there has been change, and certainly since Vatican II, there's been more understanding and acceptance of what the feminine brings to Catholicism. However, that lack of, a huge gap from a 76-year-old woman being the youngest, when she went in at age 19, that says a lot about the future of women in that particular institution,
It really does.
Yeah. So that leads itself to a lot of the informal conversation that we have about Christianity in seminary, because I don't know about you, but I was going to ask you, was it ever brought to your attention that some people don't believe Catholicism is Christian?
Many times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Many times.
And
yes.
Usually it's by people that really don't understand or know anything about Catholicism.
Right.
It's a kind of societal trope. Oh, right. The Catholic Church is the horror of Satan.
Yeah. the bride of, the devil. I found that really fascinating because going into a Methodist theological seminary, I kind of anticipated I would hear more of that. We are looking at things from a much more theological space than I anticipated, which I'm really enjoying. It's actually kind of rare in any. I took 3 courses this semester, and it was really rare for anyone to have what I would call spiritual conversations about their religious experience in class. It was really more about context and what they were learning in their own experience, what they had learned about their own experience, their life experience, their positions. I mean, sometimes the positions were very, spiritual versus secular, and I'm not really sure that's the right, but, based on their belief more than on actual texts, So that was really interesting to me and has been. But I feel like overall in this class, my position on sacred text has changed. My position on that word sacred is still a little bit, I don't know enough about, or I haven't come across the right language to explain where I come from on the position of the sacred. So I leave that to discovery. I leave that to be discovered. I definitely have a more palatable understanding of other religions and where they are coming from on social justice and certainly on sacred texts. However, I posit that just like us growing up Catholic, most people have a very personal experience within that text that may not reflect all of that. I mean, my experience as a Catholic is very different from the experience of my mom, from
And
my aunt,
even from me,
from you.
11 years
And
apart. It's just
yeah,
totally. When I was a little kid, they were still saying the Mass in Latin.
yeah. So what that leads me to say at the end of our talk today is that I would rather have a conversation about how social justice within a text, such as the Quran or such as the Torah or even the Bible, like the New Testament, I don't believe it should be read as, okay, how do I say this without, I don't want to be rude, but I don't think that it's right to say that every Jew follows the law of the Torah. Every Catholic follows the law of the Catholic Bible, for example. It hasn't been true in my experience, and it hasn't been true for anyone I've ever met. I do not have the same belief system as everyone or
Well,
anyone.
obviously, there's priests and nuns who don't follow the sacred texts of their own religion.
Exactly. And so it's a problematic for me in courses such as this one to be that generalizing. And that's my post assessment. My post assessment says I understand sacred text better. I understand that even secular groupings or such people can have sacred texts. I still don't understand the sacred aspect from an agnostic position, and I will probably never. And I also say, as I've just said, that I feel more informed about what perhaps foundational social justice texts look like within the major religions, but I don't agree that it's fair or right to say, as a Jew, this is what you believe. As a Christian, this is what you believe. Everybody, no, I don't believe that.
How
So,
would your perception change if you replace the word sacred text with precious text?
I like that. Yeah. Precious text feels more legitimate to my experience.
And it's very individual.
Yes. I love that. So let's go ahead and, we can talk about building out some curriculum for precious texts.
Precious.
Thank you so much for participating today, Tracy. I would like to have you end once again explaining why we're here and what we're doing in terms of your business, if you wouldn't mind.
I'm going to take a quick run at an elevator speech about Annex and just say this. In our philosophy, we base the ability of a human being to achieve their self-actualization on Maslow's pyramid, where you start out with a firm foundation, safety, belonging. We assist people in getting to those higher tiers by providing them with a firm foundation, a way to provide safety and security and work, starting with the key issues that Maslow described. Maslow's pyramid has been improved and revised many times, but basically a foundation that provides the ability for a person to think, to work, to survive. You have to be able to think and work. You have to have food. You have to have shelter. And then we go up towards the rungs, and there are many critics that assert that no one ever reaches self-actualization. So they did change that. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that at all.
I don't agree with that either. No.
Self-actualization in itself, that's how you perceive yourself to be as the penultimate, the ultimate person that you were born to be on a daily basis.
Yeah, just ask any 40-year-old woman. It's like you get to be 40 years old and suddenly you're like, oh, I am who I am. Hopefully you have the same feelings that we do, which is, God, I love me, because of every experience you've experienced, brought you to that point. And then what I love about what you're doing as a consultant is you're talking to people about integration. And can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? So the holistic aspect of what you do.
I see. Again, we are just looking at the 4 or however many, you might want to break it down into more or less quadrants that make a healthy human being.
Right.
Well, and we will address those: health, spirituality, belonging to a community, ability to grow. The most beautiful representation is the Native American medicine wheel, which I wish I had one right in front of me right now so I could point out those sectors, but it's easy to find one.
Right.
And it's beautifully representative of exactly what Annex stands for.
Right. And just to finish this out, we are available for any topics that we speak on within the framework of Annex Talk, as well as other consulting type speaking engagements, workshops, and conferences. And this is what we do, and this is what we love. And we also want to make ourselves available for any type of consulting for businesses that are interested in a more, I use this word in framework, holistic way of
holistic management can apply to any business, organization, family, project, anything. A perfect way to achieve sustainability.
Sustainability being the ultimate goal, and whether that's throughout a workshop for a team building or for a personal experience. It's life coaching, it's life training, and life happens at work. It happens at home. It happens in the churches, and it happens in your community. And so this is what our focus is. And through this amazing work that my sister has done in this foundation, in this business, we make ourselves available. And you can reach us through the subscription here, as well as through the links below. So thank you so much. We know this was a longer program today. This will be going to my professors for Sacred Justice and Social Texts at Methodist Theological School of Ohio, and letting them know what a semester has been like from the experience of me and my sister, my brilliant and beautiful sister. So, Tracy, thank you so much for your input as always. Really, really intelligent. Wonderful to speak to you today.
My pleasure.
And
thank you for
look
including
forward
me.
to doing this again next week.
Thank you. Have a wonderful week. Love you.
Too. Yeah.